Hey guys, it's Kimberly and I'm back with you for another creepy storytelling. I would love to jump right into the story, and today's story is called My Brother Died When I Was a Child. He Kept Talking. I think people should know what he said. We'd all known Dennis had less than a week to live, and we'd braced ourselves for all the good that would do. This was going to tear us apart and leave a ragged gaping hole in our lives. But that would be it. It would fit within our understandings of things, and we could all assume he went wherever we thought people go. That would have been so much easier, so much less troubling than what actually happened. Dennis had been diagnosed with cancer a couple of days after his 10th birthday, and it was all downhill from there. There was never an upswing, never an opportunity for surgery. All the scans showed the same thing. The oily black webs have grown larger and denser. The fact that we were twins and had looked identical right up to when he started chemo just made it worse. There I was, right beside him, a perfect image of what he used to be before his hair fell out and his color drained and his cheeks sunk down into his skull. An emaciated ghost constantly contrasted with what he should be. And then finally the doctors shut the case, snuffed out a last wisp of hope. Dennis will most likely not last more than 4 days, a week at most. So we'd all set up camp in his musty room at the hospital. The walls were freckled and pea green. The only light slanted in from between the shutters. Glaring bars stretched out across the floor to end just short of Dennis's bed. The staff managed to bring in another, simpler bed for me, and my parents slept on old wicker chairs. Dennis looked really bad at this stage. You could as good as see his skull. We all wanted to talk to him, to make the most of whatever time was left. But he slept for most of the day, and when he woke up, there'd just be silence. Nobody knew what to say. There were no right words. And there was this underlying fear that the moment anybody interacted with the situation, they'd somehow make it real, and it would hit everyone. The first sound would knock us all off the tightrope, and we'd fall into tears and chaos, and we wouldn't be able to pull ourselves back up. So there was silence. My parents occasionally forcing smiles that never made it to their eyes. The third day was when it finally happened, when the steady beeping of the heart monitor started to break down into frantic electronic wails, and Dennis began to shake feebly as a dry, cackling sound rose up from his mouth. My parents exploded out of their chairs, my mother heading straight to Dennis, grabbing his shoulders and pleading at him to stop it and be all right. My father was at the room door, screaming down the hallway for help. The doctors and nurses at the hospital had changed lately. They started treating Dennis differently. Before the resuscitations were always these frantic, desperate efforts, like 100-meter sprints. There was a desperate desire to succeed in every single moment. Now it was different, more like a steady jog. These were people who were going through the motions, ticking off things they were meant to try from the little checklists in their minds. I don't think it would have made a difference either way. The cancer had finally tipped over, and his system just couldn't shoulder it anymore. They called it and left, offering their condolences and saying they'd take away the body when we were ready. The door clicked shut behind us, me, Mom, Dad, and Dennis's corpse. We all inched closer, up to the side of his bed, and just looked. My mother cracked, breaking into giant howling tears. My father pulled her closer, trying to keep it together, but losing it in his own way. No sobs from him, just the occasional tear running down his face, and sharp breaths busting through his clenched teeth. I was just quietly staring at Dennis's face. We all stood there for a long time. I finally realized that this wasn't just one thing. This wasn't a single event. For the first time in my mind, started running away with itself and unfolding all of the endless implications of this. Every one of them causing my gut to sink, and for me to miss him so much, even though he'd just been here. I was never going to talk to him again. He was never going to laugh at me again. We were never eating dinner again. We were never going to school together again. We were never going to be in the same class in school again, or talk during classes at school again. It just kept going and going as I realized that this wasn't just one person I'd lost. I'd lost a million things. Something that was meant to be this constant presence was gone, and nothing would ever be as good as it should be again. Everything I was going to do be soured by the certainty that I would be doing it without him, or that I wouldn't be able to tell him about it later. It had only ever been a childish assumption that any of that would happen. I was the first to see his lip quiver. "Mom, Dad, his lips are moving." My parents froze, still clasped against each other, my mother curled over and supported by my father. We looked down as his lips continued to quiver. My parents went quiet again. They must have been trying to hold back hope, assuming it was some kind of nervous tic. But it kept going, and finally, in a dusty, hoarse voice, so faint it was like you were hearing it on the wind, he said my name. Harry. My father sprinted across the room, yelling for the nurses to come back. My mother was clutching her mouth and stumbling back from the bed. The workers tumbled back in and went through the checklist and shocked him with the defibrillators a few times and reached their verdict. "We're sorry. He's still dead." "But I heard him talk," said my father in a small pleading voice. "Look, it could have been gas escaping." "But," said my father before a tiny scraping sound cut through the room. Everyone turned towards the source. It was coming from Dennis, halfway between a sigh and a croak. "Harry, it's all so dark, so cold, so dark, and it's pulling at my insides and taking me down." A moment later, nurses started on their rounds again, but this wasn't some perfunctory run through the checklist. You could see it on their faces, in how hurried their movements were. They didn't know what was happening. They weren't even sure they were doing the right thing. They moved on to the defibrillator again, sending crashing waves of power down through Dennis's chest before listening with a stethoscope. "Doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense," one was mumbling. After 10 minutes, they all just stepped back. They'd run the checklist out. Nothing had happened. "What's happening?" my mother screamed. One of the men, a doctor I think, answered. "Nothing is happening. We try and pump in oxygen, and it does nothing. There's no pulse, and we can't induce one for more than a second or two. The body's temperature's down 3 degrees. He's deceased." "But we heard him," I said. "I know, but he's dead." The dry grating came again, and everyone shut up. "Please, Harry, where are you?" I walked over to his side. I wasn't relieved he was talking. I was only afraid. This was wrong. I wanted to run. I wanted him to be gone so I could cry with my parents and be done with it. But I kept walking and put my hands on his bony, cold, and clearly dead hands. "I'm here," I said. "I can see gray. A little bit of gray, but it's so far away. I don't just see it. I feel it. I feel it, and I never knew I could be so far away. I'm already so far down, but I need to go so much further to get to the gray." I didn't know how to respond, so I just stood there and listened to him talk about the darkness and the distant gray smudges. Sometimes he'd answer me, sometimes he wouldn't. A lot of stuff happened around me for the next few hours. Everyone who worked at the hospital must have been in and out. Even my parents started to leave sometimes when they accepted I was the only one Dennis seemed to be aware of. Dennis was looked at by every type of doctor they had in there, and no one understood. They started moving him around on a stretcher, taking him to the equipment they couldn't bring to him. I had to come along. I was the only one who kept him talking. It was a long time before anything was turned up. They'd gotten desperate and had put Dennis in the MRI machine. They'd fully prepped a corpse and put it in a machine for the living. My entire family was in the room. A cold, confused fear had settled in my gut, making me feel a little bit like throwing up. "I think we've got something," said the technician who was looking at the monitors. "Please just tell us what's happening," said my mother. She'd moved past terror and hope and was now, above all else, exhausted, her red face slack and empty. "Look, The scan looks for where the blood is in his brain. Well, the thing is that none of the blood in the brain is moving. We know that from his pulses, but something is happening in there. Something the machine can only pick up a little, but there's some kind of activity. Now I can't be sure, but I think the activity is clustered around some of the parts that control movement. Everything else is totally dead. He's obviously conscious. He's using complete sentences, but... But what? Said my father. But it's like whatever is doing the thinking is somewhere else, still interacting with the stuff that does the talking. That's exactly right, came a voice behind us. I looked over my shoulder and saw an old man in a gray business suit. He had a well-trimmed silver beard and was all around a strange contrast to the clumsy chaos that had engulfed the hospital. "Who are you?" said the technician. "I'm Daniel Cohans," he said, handing the technician a crisp business card. "With the Orpheus Institute. We're a semi-private medical research body, and we've dealt with a few cases similar to this one. The hospital president has already agreed to let us look into this." Almost invisibly, a number of men had moved in behind Cohan and were now making their way over to the technician. These men will help explain the confidentiality situation surrounding issues like this. We'll handle the boy from here. More men, these ones in pure white scrubs that had a strange logo on the left breast, got Dennis onto a stretcher and led us all into the hallway. We followed wordlessly, never thinking to say anything, because at least these new people represented new possibilities. A completely new road that might lead to an explanation. They rolled Dennis into an operating theater, and my mom gasped. "Look, just what are you doing?" said my father in a husky voice that made it obvious he was still holding in tears. Cohans, who had been striding ahead of the stretcher with a speed that belied his age, had stopped once we got to the theater, and was now taking deliberate care to look us all three in the eyes. We were still in the hallway, the operating theater doors shut behind us. He answered in a low, comfortable tone. "We're not performing surgery. It's just the quietest place of the hospital, and there are no distractions in there. We want nothing more than to understand what is happening to your son. This sort of thing has happened before. Your son is conscious, and as we understand, he will only talk to his brother here. We want to use Harry to ask Dennis our questions. We believe this would work best if he and Harry were alone. We've got the theater wired so that we can hear the answers." My parents didn't say anything for a while. My father broke the silence with weak, staggered words. "Do you think he might come back? I know that even if he does, it won't be for long, but I'd really like him back, for however long. I didn't say enough. I wasn't big enough to say the things that we had to say to each other. If such a thing is possible, I swear we will do everything in our power to make it happen. We prepared a private waiting room for you two." Cohen gestured down to the turn in the hallway. There were two people in white scrubs standing there. "Pete and Shirley will lead you there. If you would please go with them." My parents began to shuffle down the corridor, my mother still buried in my father's side. My father kept throwing looks back over his shoulder at me, like he was afraid I'd vanish. Soon they were gone, and I felt Cohen's hand come down on my shoulder. I turned around to him, and he knelt down so we were closer to being level. "I know this is very hard on you. I know this must be the worst day of your life, but do you think you could do a quick history lesson?" I couldn't bring myself to answer properly, but some curiosity managed to rise through the delirium of shock, and I nodded. Cohen smiled. One of the most significant moments in human history was the moon landing, and it's not even the fact itself that makes it so important. It's that we had contact with them the whole time they were up there. They were sending radio signals back to Earth and could be talked to. Do you think the moon landing would be what it was if we didn't have that kind of connection to our men as they strode the unsettling and inhospitable surfaces of a place we were never meant to have knowledge of? What if they had just gone up there and never came back? What if they knew for sure that they got there but had no signal from them? I was still quite out of it, so I can't say I was properly digesting all of this, so I slurred out, "I don't know." They didn't know if they could get the astronauts back. It was a very real possibility that they'd be left up there stranded, yet they still did it. It didn't matter if the mission was a failure. It didn't matter if there was no triumphs or turn. Do you know what mattered? What mattered more than anything was speaking to them while they were up there. To have that connection to three brave men in the void, describing man's first step into the unknown. If they'd never come back, it wouldn't have changed anything, as long as we down here managed to make that connection to the beyond. As long as we down here, for however long, had men up there, men to describe the soil, men to explain the feeling of being so light, men to tell us what Earth looked like, cut in half by the lunar horizon, men to teach us about a new world. His hand tightened on my shoulder. None of that would have been possible without the people in Houston, without the men who talked to the astronauts, kept them focused, made sure we got the information we needed. Harry, we believe Dennis is in a very strange place, that humanity would do well to learn about it. You are Houston. Your brother is an astronaut. He pulled a laminated sheet out from under his lapel. Here's a sheet with some topics you should focus on and questions you should ask. This should help you get the most useful and needed information. But the most important thing is to keep him talking. Stop talking for 5 seconds and you can lose him. I accepted the card, having given up on reaching a decent understanding of the situation. He ushered me to the operating theater and shut the door behind me. I was alone. The only sound, an almost inaudible ringing that emanated from a mass of stainless steel racks and implements, and the cold, sturdy operating table Dennis was laying on. I approached the table and, in need of any sort of guidance, I looked at the laminated sheet. General principles. Try to keep your loved one / the subject unaware of their deceased state. Past experience suggests that the shock may cause disconnection. Maintain constant conversation, as this has been shown to help maintain the connection. Do not ask leading questions, such as whether your loved one / the subject is having experiences in line with your own religious beliefs. First step. Ask your loved one / the subject to describe their experience and / or surroundings. Encourage them to be as... A gasp pulled my attention away from the sheet. "Harry," Dennis said. "Yes, it's me," I answered, grabbing his hand. There was no doubt that he really was dead. His hand was ice cold, and the fingers had locked in place at odd angles, with rigor mortis. His entire body had gone from a sickly white of the dying to the rain cloud shade of the dead. I got to the gray, to the ground, came down easy, like a leaf, cold. I'm standing there now. "Dennis, can you describe where you are?" "It's still gray, but it's more real now. Solid. Gray sand underneath. Gray ocean, believe me. Gray clouds above. Don't remember going through the clouds, but there they are now. The clouds. They're screaming." "An ocean?" I said. "Can you see anything in the ocean?" Dennis took in a phlegmy, pointless breath. "Far away. The horizon. It gets dark. Dark, hungry line where even clouds stop, where everything stops. Darkness is clawing, moving like it's alive. Miles and miles of angry, hungry dark. Can't go there. Can't go that way." At this point, I lost the thread of the exchange, as perspective suddenly hit. All the things I didn't understand, and the fact that whatever Dennis was, he wasn't alive. I broke, crying and wailing and digging my face into his bare, emaciated ribs, cold like meat straight out of the fridge. I kept squeezing his hand, harder and harder, pushing the stiff fingers closer together. I think I'm going to leave this part here, guys. This is a really long story. I didn't think it was going to be as long as it actually is. So I'm going to pick up where I left off in the next week's video. And until then, I hope you have a great week, and I will see you next time. Bye!